Hello everyone and welcome to Wormwood Tales. Relax and enjoy the story for sleep video. Before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Let's begin. Mark had always thought of himself as a practical man. After years of sharing cramped spaces with roommates, he had finally found a place he could call his own, a modest one-bedroom apartment in an old brick building downtown. The building had character arched hallways, creaky floors, and antique fixtures that gave it a certain charm he hadn't found anywhere else. In a city where everything felt new and constantly changing, his apartment was a rare find. It was calm, and for the first time in years, Mark felt like he could finally breathe. The days passed quietly, filled with the routine of settling in, arranging furniture, hanging up curtains, and adjusting to the faint hum of city life outside his window. He began to enjoy the solitude, reveling in the silence of the nights. He was too practical to be superstitious or easily spooked, and the building's age, with its occasional strange noises and settling walls, didn't bother him. But then, one night changed everything. It was a Tuesday, and Mark had gone to bed a little after midnight. He fell into a deep sleep, the kind where hours pass in what feels like minutes. But something pulled him from his slumber. His eyes flickered open, and he glanced at the clock on his nightstand 2:00 a.m. exactly. He had no idea why he'd woken up so suddenly, but there was a prickling feeling at the back of his neck, a sense of being watched. He tried to shake it off as just a strange dream lingering on the edge of his consciousness. But then he saw it. A figure, dark and still, was standing just outside his window. It wasn't someone walking by or an ordinary shadow cast from a streetlight. This was different. The figure didn't move, didn't waver, and seemed almost unnatural in its stillness. It was a silhouette, tall and unmoving, almost blending into the shadows of the night. Mark's heart hammered in his chest as he sat up slowly, squinting to make sense of what he was seeing. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and leaned closer, thinking it had to be a trick of the light. But the figure remained, as clear as ever, like it was rooted to the ground just outside his window. No face, no features, just a dark, looming shape that seemed to press in on the glass, as if staring straight into his room. "Who?" he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He felt frozen, his practical mind scrambling for an explanation. But deep down, he felt something he hadn't felt since he was a kid, hiding under his blankets from nightmares, fear. Finally, he tore his gaze away, squeezing his eyes shut, breathing heavily as he tried to shake off the sight. When he dared to look again, it was gone. The street outside was empty, bathed in dim light from a flickering street lamp down the block. Silence filled his room once more. Mark lay back down, telling himself it was a trick of his imagination, a strange shadow cast by something in the distance. But a cold feeling lingered, gnawing at him as he tried to fall asleep. He didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. After the first sighting, Mark told himself it was nothing, a simple trick of the light, a shadow cast by passing cars, or maybe just his imagination. He hadn't slept well since moving in, and new job stress was weighing on him, so he tried to shake it off. But on the second night, it happened again. Mark was pulled from sleep suddenly, his eyes snapping open. He lay still in his bed, his heart thudding in his chest. The room was dark, but the street lamp outside cast a dim glow through his thin curtains. And there it was, a shape, darker than the night, standing outside his window. This time, Mark's pulse quickened. He lay frozen, watching the shadow's unmoving form. It was tall, almost unnaturally so, and it had no defined edges. Just a dark, dense silhouette, as if someone had blotted out the light with an ink-stained thumb. He squinted, trying to make sense of it, his mind racing for some kind of logical explanation. The figure didn't move, but Mark could feel it watching him. After what felt like an eternity, he finally forced himself to turn on the lamp beside his bed. He glanced back to the window, but the shadow was gone. He felt a strange, sick relief, but something gnawed at him. Why did it feel so personal? Night after night. By the third night, Mark's anticipation of the shadow's appearance was enough to keep him awake. He lay in bed, staring at the clock, feeling his heart race with each passing minute. Midnight, 1 a.m. He tried to distract himself, scrolling through his phone, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At exactly 2 a.m., he glanced toward the window, and his stomach dropped. The shadow was there, in the exact same spot. But tonight, it seemed different. It seemed closer. The darkness around its form felt thicker, as though it absorbed any light that touched it. Mark's hands grew clammy as he stared, paralyzed by a fear he couldn't fully understand. He told himself to get up, to turn on the light or pull the curtain shut, but he couldn't bring himself to move. Deep down, he was afraid that if he looked away, the shadow would come closer. Night after night, the same scene unfolded. Mark couldn't tell anyone, his friends would think he was paranoid or losing sleep over work. But each night, he felt the shadow drawing nearer. On the fifth night, it had shifted a full step toward his window. On the sixth, he could almost make out the faint outline of a head and shoulders. And by the seventh night, Mark could swear he saw a pair of eyes, two hollow, black pits staring directly into his. He started keeping the lights on all night, hoping it would drive the shadow away. But even the brightness didn't seem to matter. The figure returned, undeterred, watching him from just outside the thin glass pane. As each night passed, Mark's sense of dread grew. He couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow was somehow waiting for him. And that whatever it was slowly closing the distance between them. Growing desperate, Mark tried talking to his neighbors. But his questions were met with cold stares and closed doors. Finally, he managed to corner his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Evans, in the hallway. She was a kind, quiet woman, the type who always seemed to know everyone's business. "Mrs. Evans, have you ever seen anything strange around here at night?" he asked, his voice low and uncertain. Her face went pale. She glanced over her shoulder, as if expecting someone or something to be watching them. "You best mind your own business," she whispered. "Some things aren't meant to be disturbed." With that, she hurried away, leaving Mark with a feeling of dread that only deepened with her warning. Her words echoed in his mind as he walked back to his apartment. Some things aren't meant to be disturbed. The sense of helplessness clawed at him. He had no idea what the shadow wanted, but he felt certain of one thing: it was coming closer. Mark couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. Every night the shadow appeared, inching closer, growing darker, and standing more prominently in his view. Driven by the need to understand, he began investigating, hoping to find a logical explanation. Maybe a previous tenant had played a trick, or maybe it was an odd atmospheric effect. But the more he dug, the stranger the story became. Starting with the building's history, he uncovered that it was originally built in the 1920s as a lavish apartment complex catering to the city's elite. However, after several mysterious deaths, the building had fallen into disrepair, becoming a boarding house and then low-rent apartments. In all the tales of its former residents, a recurring pattern surfaced: strange incidents and whispered rumors about an unwanted guest that arrived uninvited. Mark's search took him to a public records office, where he spent hours poring over faded newspapers and dusty city archives. One article from the 1950s caught his eye: "Local resident disappears mysteriously after reporting shadow stalker." The article described a young woman named Eleanor, who lived in the same building. She had reported seeing a shadow outside her window each night, always arriving at exactly 2 a.m. She confided in a few close friends, describing the figure as dark and silent but somehow menacing. Within a week of reporting the shadow, Eleanor vanished. No trace of her was ever found. The police searched for months, but the case eventually went cold. The shadow had appeared for her and then she was gone. A chill crept over Mark as he read. But the story didn't end there. Further research revealed other cases, residents who had disappeared under equally eerie circumstances. In 1972, a middle-aged man, recently moved into the building, had reported seeing a dark figure just outside his window. Friends said he became paranoid, his behavior erratic. One night, he left his apartment and never returned. The police found his wallet and belongings untouched, as if he had simply stepped out into the night and vanished. Every tenant who had seen the shadow seemed marked by misfortune. One woman in the 1980s, the record stated, had tried to ignore the shadow entirely, but she was found dead in her apartment a month later. The coroner listed her cause of death as heart failure, but her neighbors swore she had been a healthy woman in her 40s with no history of heart issues. The strangest part? Each witness described the shadow in a similar way: featureless, silent, and gradually getting closer with each passing night. Mark was shaken. The pattern was clear: the shadow appeared, watched, waited, and then claimed its victim. But there was something else. One of the last articles he found mentioned a supposed curse. According to a neighbor interviewed at the time, the shadow wasn't just a presence, it was a seeker of lost souls, drawn to those who felt isolated or afraid. After hours spent unraveling the building's dark past, Mark returned to his apartment, his mind heavy with dread. That night, he tried to stay awake, hoping to catch the shadow in action. But as soon as the clock struck 2 a.m., exhaustion overcame him, and he fell into a restless sleep. He dreamed of the shadow coming closer, of Eleanor and the others, each whispering his name, warning him. When he awoke, the terror he'd felt in his dream lingered. The more he learned, the closer the shadow seemed to come. But he wasn't sure if he could stop it or if he even wanted to know how far it would go. At this point, Mark was both terrified and trapped by his own curiosity. He began losing sleep, counting down the hours until 2 a.m., feeling helpless as he awaited that familiar, dreadful presence outside his window. The shadow was drawing closer every night, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before it was inside with him. What would you do? He wondered, even as a hollow voice seemed to echo that same question in his mind. If you knew something was out there every night, watching, waiting, what would you do? Would you have the courage to confront it, stare it down until it left you alone? Or would you turn away, pretend it wasn't happening, hoping it would disappear on its own? Most of us, when faced with something terrifying, do everything we can to ignore it, convincing ourselves that fear is all in our heads. But what if it's not? What if ignoring it only makes it stronger? With each sighting, Mark's nerves frayed. His friends noticed the change in him. He was jumpy, distracted, barely sleeping. But how could he tell them the truth? How could he make them understand what it's like to feel eyes on you when you're alone, or the sound of something moving when the room is silent? Mark thought about leaving, packing up and running from whatever horror was slowly creeping closer. But what if leaving isn't an option, he thought, his heartbeat quickening at the thought. What if I leave, and it follows me? He lay there, wide awake one night, trying to convince himself to stay calm. But as the clock struck 2 a.m., he felt a chill wash over him, as if he were no longer alone. Heart pounding, he sat up, grabbed his phone, and, in a desperate attempt to catch it, snapped a picture of his room, illuminated only by the faint glow from the streetlights outside. Have you ever done that? Snapped a picture in the dark, hoping to see nothing, but secretly afraid of what might be there? Mark stared at the photo in shock. There it was. The shadow wasn't outside his window this time. It was standing right next to his bed. As the shadow's appearances continued each night, Mark's sanity started to crack. He couldn't sleep, couldn't think, and his friends began noticing the toll it was taking. Dark circles under his eyes, the jittery glances he threw over his shoulder, and his constant checking of windows were becoming all too obvious. Yet Mark felt trapped. He'd tried looking away, ignoring it, even staying at a friend's place for a night, but the pull of the shadow only grew stronger, calling him back each time. Then came the 8th night. It started like every other, the ticking clock, his heart pounding, and the haunting quiet that seemed to settle around his apartment, thicker and heavier than the night itself. This time, though, he sensed it was different. The air felt charged, like the moments before a lightning strike. Mark sat, wide-eyed, staring out the window, waiting for the shadow to appear. But at 2 a.m., nothing happened. No dark figure, no movement. Just the quiet, empty street below. A sliver of relief started to creep into his mind. Maybe it was finally over. But then he felt it. A cold, crawling sensation slowly spread over his body, prickling his skin. The room's temperature seemed to plummet, his breath coming out in misty puffs, though it was a warm summer night. He realized with horror that the shadow wasn't outside the window this time, it was inside his apartment. A sense of primal fear washed over him, and he turned, hoping he was wrong. But there it was, standing right beside his bed, looming over him. Mark's phone was still in his hand, so he raised it, snapping a photo in desperation, hoping that capturing it would break its hold over him. The flash briefly illuminated the room, and in that momentary light, he saw the shadow more clearly. It wasn't just a dark shape, it had faint, hollowed-out eye sockets, empty and endless, staring straight at him. And it had a mouth, twisted into a smile, wide and jagged, like something trying to imitate human expression but failing miserably. Then it spoke. "You cannot leave me." The voice was a low, rumbling whisper that echoed within his head, each word vibrating in his bones. He stumbled back, barely able to process the words. His heart pounded in terror, each beat feeling like a hammer in his chest. In a final act of desperation, he bolted out of the apartment, racing down the stairs and out into the city streets. He didn't stop running until he was several blocks away, out of breath and drenched in cold sweat. He thought he'd finally escaped, but then he noticed the temperature dropping again, colder and colder, even though it was still summer. He glanced into the dark window of a nearby shop, desperate for any sign of normalcy, but his blood ran cold when he saw his reflection only. He wasn't alone. The shadow was there, standing just behind him, a dark figure blending with his silhouette, its eyes locked onto his in the reflection. It had followed him. As he stumbled backward, the whispers returned, softer now, but clearer than ever. "You will never leave me. Not now, not ever."